When did the so-called golden child finally crash? My brother Kyle could never be wrong in our parents' eyes, while anything I did was treated like a disappointment or somehow not enough. He'd skip family dinners to hang out with friends, and Mom would say, "Oh, Kyle needs his social time." But when I had drama club, she'd guilt-trip me about missing precious family moments. Kyle got caught cheating on 3 different tests in high school, and Dad still called the principal to say it was just stress from being so talented. When I got a B+ in chemistry, they hired a tutor because clearly I was struggling. The double standard was unbelievable. Kyle wrecked his car drunk at 19, and they covered it up and bought him a brand new truck because he learned his lesson. When I accidentally scraped the garage door, I had to pay for repairs out of my part-time job because responsibility builds character. Kyle dropped out of college after 2 semesters, and they said he was finding himself. I graduated with honors and got told, well, anyone can get good grades if they have no social life. They turned the garage into a recording studio when Kyle randomly decided he wanted to be a musician, even though he never practiced or wrote a single song. When I asked for help with my student loans, they told me they needed to be smart with money, and I should learn independence. Kyle stole money from Mom's purse, and she convinced herself she must have spent it. When her jewelry went missing, she blamed herself for misplacing it. Dad's tools disappeared, and he assumed he loaned them out. Anytime I pointed out the obvious pattern, I was accused of being jealous. Then Kyle started a business with $20,000 of their retirement money. It failed in 3 months, and they said, at least he tried. When I asked for just $1,000 to take a certification course, they told me maybe next year. The final straw was when Grandma Dorothy got sick. She had about $200,000 she planned to leave equally to the grandkids. Kyle suddenly became the devoted grandson, visiting her every day and taking over her finances. My parents praised him nonstop. Within 3 months, her savings were disappearing. Kyle blamed medical expenses, but never showed receipts. He bought her the cheapest groceries and pocketed the rest. He convinced her to sign power of attorney, and my parents refused to question anything. When Grandma died 6 months later, almost all her money was gone. The lawyer noted suspicious transfers, but because Kyle had power of attorney, everything was technically legal. My parents defended him again. Then my cousin Ella, who worked at the bank, pulled me aside. She'd seen the transfers. Kyle had been moving Grandma's money to his account, and then straight into a casino app. $200,000 gone in 6 months, while Grandma lived in a freezing house eating generic food. Ella had screenshots of every transaction. I called a family meeting. Before I even spoke, Kyle got defensive, but I handed out the printed screenshots. $50,000 to Kyle's account on January 10th. 3 hours later, $50,000 to Bet King Casino. Then $30,000. Then $40,000. Every transfer matched. Kyle tried to grab the papers, but everyone had seen them. Uncle Robert, a cop, stood up and asked Kyle to explain why Grandma's money went to online gambling while she was dying. Kyle actually said Grandma wanted him to invest it for the family, and gambling was his investment strategy. The room exploded. Robert got right in his face with that cop posture that makes people confess. Kyle backed away, sweating, while Mom screamed at Robert for attacking her son, and Dad yelled for him to stop. But Robert didn't move, just stared him down and asked if Kyle was seriously calling stealing $200,000 an investment strategy. Kyle opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Mom pushed between them, actually placing her hands on Robert's chest and shoving him, telling him he was being aggressive and she wouldn't allow that behavior in her home. I stayed in my chair, bank statement in hand, watching everything unfold like a movie. Aunt Linda was crying by the fireplace, and relatives were talking over each other, some questioning Kyle, some defending him, others just shocked. My parents literally positioned themselves on either side of Kyle like bodyguards, Mom on his left, Dad on his right, creating a human wall between him and the rest of us. Uncle Robert stepped back slightly but kept his eyes locked on Kyle, every muscle in his jaw tense. Kyle scanned the room like he was looking for an escape route, eyes darting from person to person. Then he made his move. He bolted for the front door, shoving past Mom so hard she stumbled into the coffee table. Uncle Robert was faster, police training, no doubt, and cut him off before he got halfway across the living room. Robert planted himself in front of the door, arms crossed, telling Kyle he wasn't leaving until he explained where Grandma's money went. Kyle tried to get around him, but Robert just sidestepped and blocked him again. Then my dad did something I'd never seen in 30 years. He shoved Robert, both hands on his chest, yelling at him to get out of Kyle's way. Robert barely moved, staring at my dad like he couldn't believe it. For a moment, I thought they might actually fight in the living room. The room went quiet except for Aunt Linda's crying. Then Ella spoke in her calm, precise bank voice. She said she had been tracking these transfers for months, with documentation of every single transaction. Her voice was steady, but you could hear the steel underneath. She explained Kyle wasn't just transferring money occasionally. He was moving funds almost daily toward the end, sometimes 3 or 4 times in a single day. She had dates, times, amounts, everything. My mom spun to face Ella, her expression switching from protective to aggressive in seconds. She pointed at Ella, accusing her of violating banking privacy and betraying family trust, raising her voice with every word. Ella didn't flinch. Arms at her sides, she calmly explained that elder financial abuse is a mandatory reporting situation. When bank employees see suspicious patterns of an elderly person's money being drained by someone with power of attorney, they are legally required to document it and report it. She looked directly at Mom and said she was simply following the law. Uncle Robert pulled out his phone and said he was calling a detective friend who handles elder financial crimes. My dad lunged for the phone, trying to grab it, yelling that this was a private family matter and police weren't needed. Robert held the phone high like kids fighting over a toy. Dad grabbed his arm, chest to chest, red-faced and breathing hard. For a moment, I thought punches were about to fly. Aunt Linda rushed over and wedged herself between them, hands on both their chests, crying harder, mascara running, begging them to stop. Kyle dropped to his knees in the middle of the living room, hands over his face, shoulders shaking. He sobbed, big gulping sobs that felt both fake and real. Between them, he admitted he had a gambling problem. He claimed he never meant for it to get this bad, thought he could control it, and that he'd pay Grandma back when he finally hit it big. He said he was so close to a jackpot that would fix everything, just one more big win. My parents' demeanor changed instantly, like a switch had flipped. Mom dropped to her knees next to him, wrapping her arms around him and rocking him like he was a child. "It's okay, baby. You're sick. You need help, not judgment. We're going to get you through this." Dad crouched down, hand on Kyle's back, then stood and addressed the room, announcing that Kyle had admitted his gambling addiction, a recognized mental illness, and that we needed to focus on treatment rather than blame. He said anyone who loved Kyle would support him through recovery instead of attacking him at his lowest. I finally stood from my chair, bank statement still in hand, watching the scene unfold. I looked around at relatives, some nodding with Dad, some uncomfortable, some still crying. I asked if anyone remembered Grandma living in a cold house eating cheap food while Kyle gambled away her savings. Several nodded, including Uncle Robert and Ella. My parents acted like I'd said the cruelest thing imaginable. Mom accused me of being unsympathetic to Kyle's struggles. Dad said I was judging instead of showing compassion. Uncle Robert made the call anyway, walking to the kitchen to report power of attorney abuse and $200,000 transferred to gambling sites. Dad followed, protesting it would destroy the family. Mom stayed on the floor holding Kyle while he cried. I stood with the bank statements, wondering how showing evidence had become the cruel act. The front door opened. Brittany walked in with groceries, stunned at the scene. Kyle sobbing in Mom's arms, Dad standing like a guard, Uncle Robert returning from the kitchen, Aunt Linda crying in a corner, Ella holding bank statements. Brittany asked what was happening. Dad said it was private, but Ella handed her the statements and calmly explained the $200,000 transfers from Grandma to gambling sites while she was dying. Brittany went white, looked at Kyle, and asked if it was true. Kyle said he had a gambling problem. It was a disease, he couldn't control it. Brittany pressed him, asking about the $5,000 she had loaned him last month. He didn't answer. Mom and Dad immediately defended him, saying he needed support, not blame. Uncle Robert announced Detective Sarah Moore was coming to review evidence. Dad exploded, telling him to leave, but Robert refused, saying he wouldn't let Grandma's death and stolen savings be ignored. The living room split down the middle. Relatives, including Ella, Brittany, and me, on one side, my parents shielding Kyle on the other. A few relatives stayed seated nervously, unsure what to do, while my cousin from Ohio edged toward the door. Mom held Kyle, glaring at us like we were attacking him. Dad stood rigid, jaw set, done listening. The doorbell rang. Dad said no one was answering. Uncle Robert noted it was probably Detective Moore, and refusing her wouldn't help Kyle. Dad blocked the door as she announced herself. Detective Moore calmly said she could take statements at the station if he preferred, but that cooperation would help Kyle. She had documentation of suspicious transfers from an elderly woman's accounts and suspected exploitation. Dad finally unlocked the door but stayed in front of it, insisting on being present. Detective Moore walked in, took in the divided, crying family and set up at the dining table. Ella went through the bank statements. $50,000 transferred on January 10th, then to Bet King Casino 3 hours later. $30,000 on January 25th, $40,000 on February 3rd, $25,000 on February 18th. Every transaction documented, often coinciding with Grandma's medical appointments. Grandma lived in cold rooms, ate cheap food, and wore the same clothes for months while Kyle transferred money to gambling sites. Detective Moore asked Kyle to explain. He claimed Grandma approved the investment strategy verbally, and Dad and Mom nodded supportively. I interrupted to note Grandma had documented early dementia. Uncle Robert added that Kyle had pushed for power of attorney under the guise of protecting her from confusion. Kyle's face reddened, insisting Grandma had asked him to help. When asked directly if he had transferred about $200,000 to gambling sites, Kyle said he wanted to consult an attorney before answering. My parents immediately called their lawyer friend, insisting Kyle needed representation. Detective Moore calmly said she respected that, but the documented evidence spoke for itself. The bank records and transaction history clearly showed financial exploitation. She gathered her notes, gave me her card for Grandma's medical records, and left with Uncle Robert thanking her. Afterward, my parents yelled at me and Uncle Robert for involving police and making Kyle look like a criminal. Over the next week, Uncle Robert called relatives individually to compare what Kyle had told them about Grandma's expenses. Every story was different. $3,000 for medicine, major home repairs, prepaying funerals. But the totals didn't match the $200,000 missing. Aunt Linda tracked all actual expenses. Medical bills, prescriptions, utilities, groceries. The total came to about $30,000, meaning Kyle gambled away at least $170,000. Ella got approval from her bank to provide official statements on the suspicious transfers. I met with civil attorney Mr. Harrison, bringing all documentation. Bank statements, Ella's timeline, Aunt Linda's spreadsheet, and the power of attorney papers. He explained criminal prosecution was tricky due to the power of attorney, but civil action for breach of fiduciary duty was strong. Kyle's gambling clearly violated his responsibility to act in Grandma's best interest. Mr. Harrison outlined filing a civil lawsuit, potential recovery and costs, about $15,000, with no guarantee if Kyle had no assets. He said sometimes getting a legal judgment is about justice and accountability, not just money. I spoke with Uncle Robert, and he agreed to cover half the fees, saying this wasn't about money anymore. It was about finally holding Kyle accountable. We knew my parents wouldn't contribute to a lawsuit. I called Mr. Harrison to move forward. The retainer was $7,500 each. That afternoon, Mom called crying, begging me not to sue, saying it would destroy the family. I told her Kyle already destroyed it by stealing from Grandma and letting her live in terrible conditions. Dad emailed me and Uncle Robert, threatening a counter-suit if we pursued legal action, claiming we were attacking their son. Mr. Harrison said it was an empty threat, and we had full legal right to sue. We paid the retainer. Within 3 days, Kyle hired criminal defense attorney Richard Crane, building a diminished capacity defense around his gambling addiction. Detective Moore warned me this was common in financial exploitation cases, and proving Kyle knew what he was doing was wrong would be key. My parents jumped on the narrative, telling everyone Kyle was a victim of disease. Mom posted on Facebook about supporting family members struggling with addiction, getting praise from relatives who didn't know the full story. Meanwhile, I spent a weekend creating a 12-page timeline documenting Kyle's years of manipulation. Cheating in school, drunk driving, failed business, stolen money, unused recording studio, and the double standards we faced. I shared copies with Uncle Robert, Ella, and Mr. Harrison. Ella added examples of small scams Kyle ran on relatives. Borrowing $200 from Aunt Linda, $500 from Uncle Robert's son, $300 from a cousin, all unpaid. Uncle Robert interviewed more relatives and found Kyle had borrowed at least $30,000 over 3 years from 8 family members, each with a different story about why he needed it. Kyle spun stories to relatives. Medical bills, car repairs, investment opportunities. Always urgent and sympathetic, avoiding verification. Uncle Robert documented everything in a spreadsheet. We took it to Detective Moore, who said the pattern of repeated financial manipulation over years showed deliberate, deceptive behavior for personal gain, weakening the addiction defense. My parents somehow learned about Uncle Robert's interviews. Dad sent a family email claiming we were harassing Kyle, framing him as a victim and painting us as jealous and vindictive. Some relatives supported us privately, but most sided with my parents. 3 weeks later, Mom emailed that Kyle had entered a 30-day gambling treatment program, suggesting legal action should be dropped. I confirmed with Mr. Harrison that treatment didn't erase civil liability. He filed the lawsuit that same week, seeking recovery of the stolen $230,000, including interest and legal fees. Kyle's attorney filed a motion claiming Kyle had no assets, that the lawsuit was punitive, and that it would harm his recovery. Then my blood boiled. My parents announced they would pay Kyle's legal fees, despite refusing to help me with my student loans or $1,000 for a professional course, now funding a defense to protect him from accountability for stealing $200,000 from Grandma. The hypocrisy stunned me, but Mr. Harrison said it showed my parents had resources and continued enabling Kyle. We moved forward with the case. Discovery began with requests for Kyle's finances and assets. His attorney responded with disorganized papers. I spent evenings reviewing statements, highlighting transfers, cash withdrawals, restaurant receipts, online gambling payments, and unpaid credit card advances. We found a $40,000 transfer from Kyle to Brittany's account, claimed as business income. Brittany didn't know it came from Grandma's money and returned the remaining $25,000, giving a written statement confirming Kyle's deception. Afterward, Kyle bombarded me with dozens of alternating apologies and blame, claiming I was destroying his life and family. Mr. Harrison said the messages showed manipulative behavior and would help in court. Mom later called, crying, begging me to drop the lawsuit, claiming Kyle was sick and therapy was enough. When I asked if stealing $200,000 from Grandma deserved consequences, she admitted it was wrong but insisted punishment wouldn't bring her back. I realized my parents would never hold Kyle accountable, and maintaining a relationship with them meant accepting Kyle as a victim rather than a deliberate thief. I told Mom I needed space to consider the future of our relationship.